I'll never forget the road trip I took with my friends back in the summer of 2018. We were all in college, and it was that perfect time in life when you feel invincible. There were 4 of us: Matt, Sarah, Jenna, and me, Jake. We decided to drive cross-country from California to New York, taking the scenic routes and avoiding the main highways as much as possible. We thought it would be an adventure, and we were right, just not the kind we had hoped for. We set off in my old but reliable 2005 Honda CR-V. The first few days were amazing. We laughed, sang along to the radio, and stopped at every quirky roadside attraction we could find. It wasn't until we reached the remote areas of New Mexico that things started to get weird. We were on a desolate stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. No cars, no houses, not even a gas station for miles. It was late afternoon and the sun was starting to set. We had been driving for hours and we were all getting a bit restless. That's when we saw the sign for a small town called Saguaro Springs. According to the sign, it was only 15 miles off the main road, so we decided to make a detour and find a place to crash for the night. As we turned onto the narrow road leading to Saguaro Springs, the atmosphere immediately changed. The trees seemed taller and more sinister, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The air felt thick and heavy, almost like we were driving through a fog, but there wasn't any. We joked about it at first, calling it the spooky road, but deep down, I think we all felt a bit uneasy. When we finally reached the town, it was like stepping back in time. The buildings were old and weathered, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. We found a small motel on the edge of town called the Desert Rose Inn. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the parking lot was empty except for a few dusty cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. We checked in and were greeted by an elderly woman at the front desk. She had a kind smile, but her eyes were vacant, almost like she was looking right through us. She handed us the keys to our rooms 5 and 6, and told us breakfast would be served at 7 a.m. sharp. That night, we decided to explore the town a bit. It was eerily quiet, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps. We walked past a diner, a general store, and a church. All of them were closed and looked abandoned. As we walked, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sarah kept turning around, convinced she saw someone out of the corner of her eye, but there was never anyone there. We headed back to the motel and tried to get some sleep. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Jenna talking in her sleep, but when I turned over, I saw she was fast asleep. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall, and what I heard chilled me to the bone. It was a low, growly voice, repeating the same phrase over and over.
Leave before it's too late. Leave before it's too late.
I woke Jenna up and we rushed to Matt and Sarah's room. They were already awake, looking just as terrified as we were. Matt said he had heard footsteps outside their window, and Sarah swore she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. We decided we had to get out of there, so we packed up our things and went to check out. The front desk was empty, but the old woman's chair was still rocking back and forth like she had just been there. We left the keys on the counter and bolted for the car. As we drove out of town, the sense of fear lifted, but we all were still on edge. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, hours later. We found a gas station and went inside to get some coffee and calm our nerves. The cashier noticed how shaken we looked, and he asked if we were okay. We told him about our experience in Saguaro Springs, expecting him to laugh it off or tell us we were imagining things. Instead, His face went pale, and he shook his head.
"You kids are lucky to be alive,"
he said.
"Saguaro Springs has been abandoned for over 50 years. There's nothing there but ghosts and bad memories."
We didn't know what to say. It didn't seem possible, but we all knew what we had experienced. We got back in the car and drove in silence for a long time, each of us lost in our thoughts. None of us could explain what had happened, but we all knew we had encountered something truly terrifying. To this day, we don't talk about that night. It's like an unspoken pact between us. We finished our road trip, but the carefree joy we had felt in the beginning was gone. We were changed by that experience, bonded by a shared horror that we would never forget. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere and you see a sign for Saguaro Springs, do yourself a favor and keep driving. Some detours are better left unexplored. So, Devin and I decided to go camping last summer. He found this old rustic campground online and it looked perfect for a quiet weekend away. I was a bit hesitant at first because it seemed really isolated, but Devin was so excited about it. He said it would be a great escape from our busy lives. When we got there, it was just as remote as it looked in the pictures. There were only a few campsites and most of them were empty. We saw one other camper, an older man with scraggly hair and a creepy vibe. He had this beat-up old RV and kept to himself, which was fine by me. Devin said he was probably just there for the same reason we were, to get away from it all. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and started to relax. It was actually really nice at first. The air was crisp, the trees were tall, and the stars were bright. We made s'mores, told silly stories, and just enjoyed being together. But then things started to get weird. It was around midnight when we first heard it, a strange rustling noise coming from the woods. I brushed it off as animals, but Devin decided to check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and told me he'd be right back. I watched him disappear into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing up and down as he walked away. I waited and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I called out his name, but there was no answer. My heart started pounding. Something didn't feel right. I grabbed my phone and tried to call him, but there was no signal out there. Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I thought maybe he just got lost or found something interesting. After what felt like forever, I decided to go look for him. I took the spare flashlight and followed the path he took. The woods were eerily silent, and the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. I kept calling his name, but there was no response. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The flashlight beam landed on a clearing, and there was Devin's flashlight, lying on the ground, but no sign of Devin. I picked it up, my hand shaking. It was like he had just vanished. I looked around, desperately trying to find any sign of him, but there was nothing. I ran back to our campsite, hoping he had somehow returned, but the tent was empty. The fire had died down, and the night felt even colder. I didn't know what to do. Devin had the car keys, so I couldn't leave. I was trapped there, all alone. Then I remembered the creepy old camper. Maybe he had seen something. I walked over to his RV, my flashlight flickering. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. The man stood there, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me.
"Can I help you?"
he asked in a gravelly voice. "Have you seen my boyfriend?" I stammered. "He went into the woods and hasn't come back." The man just stared at me for a moment, then slowly shook his head.
"Nope. Haven't seen anyone. You should probably stay close to your campsite. It's not safe out here at night."
I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I thanked him and quickly walked away back to our tent. I spent the rest of the night huddled inside, jumping at every sound. Sleep was impossible. I just sat there hoping that Devin would show up. When morning finally came, I decided to go back into the woods and search for Devin again. I didn't get far before I heard something behind me. I turned around and there was the old man, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me.
Need some help?
He asked, but there was no kindness in his eyes. I shook my head and backed away. No thank you, I'll manage. He nodded slowly and disappeared into the woods. I felt like I was being watched, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to find Devin or get help. I returned to our campsite and rummaged through our stuff, hoping to find a spare key or something. That's when I noticed Devin's backpack was missing. It didn't make any sense. He wouldn't have taken it with him just to check a noise. Desperation took over. I started walking down the road we came in on, hoping to find a signal or another camper who could help. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, and there was no one in sight. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a car coming toward me. I waved it down, and the driver, a kind-looking woman, stopped. She let me use her phone to call for help. The police arrived a short while later and took me back to the campground to search for Devin. They found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no clues, nothing. It was like he had just disappeared into thin air. The creepy old camper was gone too, his RV nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks and there was still no trace of Devin. The police investigation went cold and we were left with so many unanswered questions. To this day, I still don't know what happened to him or who that old man really was. But I do know one thing. I will never go camping again. I remember the first message like it was yesterday. You're always so perfect. Let's see what happens when people know the truth. It was a DM on Instagram, and it came from a burner account with no followers, no posts, just a blank profile picture. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would send me something like that? I brushed it off, telling myself it was just some troll looking to mess with me. The messages didn't stop. Every day there was something new. I know where you live. You can't hide from me. Everyone will see the real you. It was terrifying. I felt like I was constantly being watched. The messages started to become more specific, more personal, like little things about my favorite coffee shop, my regular jogging route, and even the books I was reading. I confided in my best friend Jessica. She had always been there for me, through thick and thin. We met in college and instantly clicked. She was my rock, the one person I knew I could trust. I told her everything about the messages, how scared I was, and how I felt like my life was spiraling out of control. Jessica was amazing. She would come over and stay with me when I was too scared to be alone. She helped me set my Instagram to private and block the creepy account. She even suggested we go to the police, but I hesitated. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was all just a prank, right? One night, things escalated. I received a message with a photo of my bedroom window, taken from outside my house. I screamed and called Jessica. She rushed over and stayed with me, trying to calm me down. We talked late into the night, and she assured me that everything would be okay. She was so supportive, always knowing the right things to say. We called the police and they sent an officer out to take a statement. They said there wasn't much they could do with just a photo. But the messages didn't stop. They just got worse. I started getting threats of violence and I couldn't sleep. I was a nervous wreck. Jessica was there through it all, holding my hand, telling me I wasn't alone. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Little things that didn't add up. One day, I was going through old photos, trying to distract myself from the constant anxiety. I found a picture of Jessica and me from a few months ago at a party. She was wearing a bracelet, a silver chain with a tiny charm. I had seen that bracelet before, but not on her. It was in one of the photos sent by the stalker. I felt the color drain from my face. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I started paying closer attention to Jessica. She always seemed to know exactly what to say to calm me down. She knew details about the messages that I didn't remember telling her. One evening, I was at her apartment. She went to take a shower, and I saw her phone light up with a notification. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The message preview showed, "She's getting suspicious. Be careful." My hand shook as I unlocked her phone, something she had given me the password to a long time ago. I scrolled through her DMs, and there it was, the burner account. Jessica had been sending the messages to me. She was the one terrorizing me, making my life a living hell. I felt sick to my stomach. My best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone, was behind all of it. I confronted her as soon as she came out of the bathroom. At first, she denied it, but when I showed her the evidence, she snapped. Her face twisted into a look of pure hatred I had never seen before. "You think you're so perfect?" she said in a low, angry voice. "Everyone loves you, but what about me? I'm always in your shadow. I want you to feel what it's like to be scared, to feel powerless." I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jessica lunged at me and we struggled on the ground. She smashed my head into the side of the bed frame. I was dazed but able to reach up and grab the lamp on the nightstand. I swung it directly into her face and she flew backwards. I managed to get up and run out of her apartment, dialing 911 as soon as I got out. The police arrived quickly and arrested her. I still remember the look in her eyes as they took her away. It was a mix of rage and something else. Satisfaction, maybe? It's been months since that night, but the scars are still there. I've tried to move on, but it's hard. The person I trusted the most betrayed me in the worst way possible. I still get anxious when I get notifications on Instagram, and I can't shake the feeling that someone is always watching me. Jessica is in jail now, and I've started therapy to deal with the trauma. I don't think I'll ever fully recover, but I'm trying. I've learned to be more cautious about who I trust, and I've surrounded myself with people who truly care about me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice in my head, whispering those chilling words.
"You're always so perfect. Let's see what happens when people know the truth."
It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just the two of us. Me, Mark, and my best friend Owen. We had planned this road trip for weeks, mapping out every stop, every diner, and every little roadside attraction along the way. We were headed to a cabin in the woods, far from the chaos of the city. It was our chance to disconnect, unwind, and catch up. But from the moment we hit the road, things started to feel off. It began with the weather. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds hanging low like a heavy blanket. The forecast had promised clear skies, but by the time we left, a light drizzle had begun to fall. I brushed it off as bad luck, but Owen looked uneasy. He kept glancing out the window, mumbling about how the rain made the world look different, almost like it was hiding something. About an hour into our drive, we hit a long stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches intertwining above, blocking out what little light was left. The GPS signal was lost, leaving us with only the printed map we had as a backup. We were driving blind, relying on old paper directions and gut instinct. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the rain turned into a heavy downpour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. It was then that we saw the first sign of trouble, a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. We slowed down, our headlights illuminating a woman in tattered clothes. She looked like she had been through hell, her hair a tangled mess and her eyes wide with fear. Owen insisted we stop to help her. I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't leave her out there in the storm. We pulled over and she stumbled towards us, her lips quivering as she thanked us for stopping. She said her name was Ava and that her car had broken down further back. She needed a ride to the nearest town. We let her in and the car immediately felt colder. Ava didn't say much during the ride. She just stared straight ahead, occasionally glancing back as if she was afraid of something following us. Owen tried to make small talk, but she only responded with short, clipped answers. There was something unsettling about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After what felt like hours, we reached a small, dilapidated gas station. Ava insisted she get out there, despite there being no signs of life around. She thanked us again and vanished into the rain. Owen and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we decided to press on. We didn't want to be out on that road any longer than necessary. As we continued, the rain let up, but a thick fog rolled in, making it even harder to see. We both were on edge, the eerie silence between us only broken by the occasional creak of the car. That's when the strangest thing happened. The radio, which had been nothing but static, suddenly came to life. A voice, faint and crackling, whispered our names. First mine, then Owen's. We both froze, staring at the radio in disbelief. "Turn it off," Owen said, his voice trembling. I reached for the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent, repeating our names over and over. Finally, I started pounding on the radio, and suddenly it fell silent. We drove in silence for a while, both of us too scared to speak. The fog was getting thicker, and we could barely see the road ahead. My eyes were burning from straining to see through the gloom when I saw it. A dark shape in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. It was Ava. She stood there, her eyes empty, her mouth formed into a horrible, creepy smile.
"You shouldn't have left me,"
she whispered, her voice echoing in the car.
"You shouldn't have left me alone."
Before we could react, she lunged at the car, her face pressed against the windshield, her eyes filled with rage. Owen screamed, and I floored the gas pedal, swerving around her and speeding down the road. But no matter how fast we went, she was always there, a shadow in the fog, keeping pace with us. The car's engine roared, the tires screeched, but Ava's figure never wavered. It was like she was part of the fog, always just a step behind us. We didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. We just kept driving, praying that the nightmare would end. Finally, we saw the lights of the cabin through the trees. I don't know how we made it, but we did. We stumbled out of the car, breathless and shaking, and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. We locked every window, every door, and huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep. But the cabin wasn't safe. Throughout the night, we heard footsteps outside, voices in the dark, and the sound of someone scratching at the windows. Every time we looked, there was nothing there, but we knew she was out there, waiting for us. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the sun was shining. It was like nothing had happened, like the nightmare was just a bad dream, but Owen and I knew better. We left that cabin as soon as we could. We were both in shock about that night, and we barely spoke about it on the way back home. Years have passed since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that she's out there, somewhere. Every time I drive through the woods, I feel like I see her face in the trees, her eyes watching me, and I feel that one day she'll come back for us, because some things, once encountered, never let you go. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees and stars, that just feels right. So when my friends suggested we go on a camping trip for the long weekend, I was all in. There were 4 of us: me, Mike, Jenny, and Lisa. We'd been friends since college and had been on countless trips together. We decided on a remote spot in the national forest that Mike had heard about. It was supposed to be beautiful and, most importantly, isolated. We packed our gear, loaded up Mike's old SUV, and hit the road early Friday morning. The drive was long but pleasant. We chatted, laughed, and enjoyed the scenic views as we left civilization behind. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The spot Mike found was perfect. There was a small clearing surrounded by thick forest and a clear, small stream nearby. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and got a campfire going. After a quick dinner of hot dogs and chips, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the tranquility of the night. It was around 10:30 when we first heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. At first, we brushed it off as just some animal, but then the noises became more deliberate, more like footsteps. Mike, being the bravest of us, grabbed a flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it towards the sound. We didn't see anything, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We decided to turn in for the night. Mike and I shared one tent while Jenny and Lisa shared the other. I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear those footsteps again, closer this time. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by our tent, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, we woke up to find strange markings around our campsite. They looked like scratches, deep and purposeful, on the trees and on the ground. It was unsettling, but we tried to laugh it off. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, things got worse. As we sat around the campfire, we started hearing strange noises again. This time, it was a low, almost moaning sound, like someone trying to speak but failing. We were all on edge. Mike shined his flashlight around, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the immediate area. Then, out of nowhere, a rock came flying into our campsite, landing with a thud near the fire. We jumped up, hearts pounding, and looked around frantically. "Who's out there?" Mike shouted, but there was no response, just the eerie silence of the forest. We decided to stay up in shifts, keeping watch over the campsite. Mike took the first shift, then Jenny, then me. As I sat by the dying fire, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just silence. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Just as I was about to wake Mike for his shift, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, and creepy. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure took a step forward, and I could see the light reflecting on a knife in its hand. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, shouting to wake the others. Mike and Jenny were up in an instant, grabbing anything they could to use as a weapon. The figure took another step forward, the firelight casting an eerie glow on its face. It was a man, gaunt and crazy-eyed, with a horrifying grin that sent chills down my spine. "What do you want?" Mike yelled, wielding a large stick. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, grinning and staring at us. The tension was unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy and unsettling.
"You're not supposed to be here,"
he said, taking another step closer.
"This is my place."
We backed up, fear gripping us. Lisa, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "We'll leave. We didn't know. We'll pack up and go right now." The man tilted his head, considering her words. Then, without warning, he lunged at us. Mike swung the stick, but the man dodged it effortlessly, slashing at Mike with his knife. Mike fell back, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. I freaked out and grabbed the large flashlight Mike had dropped and swung it at the crazed man's head. I hit him directly on the side of the head and he fell backwards. Panic erupted. We scattered, grabbing what we could and bolting for the car. The man chased us, his laughter echoing through the trees. We reached the car, threw our gear inside, and peeled out of there as fast as we could, hearts pounding and adrenaline coursing through our veins. As we sped down the dark, winding road, I looked back and saw the man standing in the middle of the road, watching us with that same twisted grin. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, where we found a small motel and huddled together in one room, too scared to sleep. The next morning, we reported the incident to the local authorities. They took our statement but didn't seem too surprised. Apparently, there had been reports of a deranged man living in those woods for years, scaring off anyone who dared to camp there. We never went back to that spot, and to this day, I can't shake the memory of that man's evil grin. Camping just isn't the same anymore. Now, every time I hear a rustle in the bushes or a twig snap, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing that he's still out there. You know how everyone says social media can be dangerous? Yeah, I used to think they were just being paranoid until it happened to me. I'm Lucy, by the way, and I work at this cute little coffee shop downtown. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other and regulars are practically family. Well, it was like that until last summer. I had an Instagram account where I posted pictures of my lattes, the cafe's decor, and occasionally a selfie or two. Nothing too personal, just fun stuff. I love connecting with other coffee lovers and sharing my barista creations. I had about 1,000 followers, most of them strangers, but some of them were regulars from the cafe. One day I noticed a new follower. His profile was weird though. No posts, no followers, just a generic profile picture of a landscape. I thought it was a bit odd, but didn't think much of it. People make new accounts all the time, right? Anyway, he started liking all my pictures, even the really old ones. It felt like he was scrolling through my entire feed. Again, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just enthusiastic. Then the DMs started. At first, they were harmless. Compliments on my latte art, asking about my favorite coffee blends, stuff like that. I replied politely but kept it brief. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't looking to make new friends online. He seemed harmless at first, but then he started asking more personal questions, like where I worked exactly, what my shifts were, and if I lived nearby. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I started seeing some red flags here, so I ignored those messages, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. Instead, he got bolder. His messages became more frequent and insistent. "I know you're reading this, Lucy," he'd say. "Why aren't you answering?" I started getting nervous. I blocked him, hoping that would be the end of it. But blocking him didn't stop the messages. He made new accounts, each one creepier than the last. He'd send pictures of my house, my route to work, even the inside of the coffee shop. I had no idea how he was getting these pictures, and it terrified me. One day, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was a printed photo of me at work, taken from outside the cafe, with a message scrawled in red ink. "See you soon." I felt sick to my stomach. I went to the police, but they couldn't do much without knowing who he was. They suggested I delete my Instagram account, but I didn't want to let him control my life like that. Things escalated quickly after that. I started seeing a figure lurking outside the cafe. He'd be there in the mornings when I arrived, just standing across the street, watching. I told my boss, and he let me change my shifts around, hoping it would throw the stalker off. It didn't. He seemed to know every move I made. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. My friends and coworkers started noticing how jittery I was, but I didn't want to worry them. Then, one night, I was closing up the cafe alone. It was dark and the street was unusually quiet. I hurried through my closing routine, eager to get home. As I locked the door, I felt someone grab my arm. I screamed and tried to pull away, but he was strong. He whispered in my ear,
"Miss me, Lucy?"
I recognized how he said his words immediately. It was the guy from Instagram. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to break free. I managed to kick him in the shin, and he let go, cursing. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I fumbled with my keys, practically throwing myself into my car and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I sped home, tears streaming down my face. When I got inside, I collapsed on the floor, sobbing. I didn't go to work for a few days after that. My boss understood and gave me time off. I filed another police report, but they still couldn't do much. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own life. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed like him. I deleted my Instagram account, changed my phone number, and even moved to a new apartment. But the fear never left me. I don't know where he is now or if he's still watching. I try to live my life normally, but there's always this lingering dread in the back of my mind. Social media was supposed to be fun, a way to connect with people, but for me, it became a nightmare. So if you ever get that weird feeling about someone online, trust your gut. You never know who might be lurking behind the screen. I'm not one for road trips, but my friends managed to rope me into one last summer. They were all about adventure, exploring unknown places, and bonding over campfires. Me? I like the comfort of my own bed and the predictability of my daily routine. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, so I found myself packed into my friend Jeff's beat-up old van, heading off into the wilderness for a week-long trip. The first couple of days were pretty standard. We hit up some tourist spots, camped out under the stars, and even managed to find a hidden waterfall thanks to Julia's impressive map-reading skills. By the third day, we were all feeling pretty confident in our ability to navigate the backroads and find hidden gems off the beaten path. That's when we decided to take a detour. Jeff had heard about this old, abandoned town called Silent Pines. It wasn't on any of the maps we had, but according to some forum he'd been lurking on, it was a real ghost town, complete with crumbling buildings and an eerie atmosphere. Naturally, everyone was on board, and I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I went along with it. We drove for hours, the road getting narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. Our phones lost signal, so we also had no more GPS. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere. Just when I was about to suggest turning back, we saw it. A rusty, old sign barely visible through the trees that read, Silent Pines, population 0. The town was everything you'd expect from a place abandoned for decades. Houses with broken windows, overgrown yards, and an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow our footsteps. We decided to split up and explore, because that's what you do in horror stories, right? I paired up with Julia while Jeff and his girlfriend Emily took off in another direction. Julia and I wandered through a couple of houses, finding nothing more than dusty furniture and the occasional animal nest. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to focus on the thrill of exploration. Then we found the church. It stood at the center of town, a looming structure with a spire that seemed to pierce the sky. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Rows of wooden pews lined the church, and an altar stood at the far end, draped in a tattered cloth. "Creepy," Julia whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. We walked down the aisle, our footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust on the floor. As we approached the altar, I noticed something odd. A book lying open on a lectern. Its pages were yellowed with age, and strange symbols covered the parchment. It didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. "What do you think this is?" I asked, tracing a finger over the strange markings. "No idea," Julia replied, "but it's given me the creeps. Let's go find the others." As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. "Okay, this isn't funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Julia shook her head, her face pale. "I swear I didn't do anything." We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in and we pounded on the wood, shouting for Jeff and Emily. No response. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on us from all sides. I felt like I was suffocating, my heart pounding in my chest. Then we heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Julia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with words I couldn't quite understand. It felt like they were crawling under my skin, burrowing into my mind. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. Then, as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The door creaked open, and a rush of warm air flooded the church. We bolted outside, not stopping until we reached the van. Jeff and Emily were already there, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "What happened to you guys?" Jeff asked, his voice shaking. "We got trapped in the church," I said, gasping for breath, "and there were these whispers." "We heard them too," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were in the schoolhouse. It felt like they were trying to tell us something." We didn't stick around to find out what. We piled into the van and drove out of Silent Pines as fast as Jeff could manage. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally started to relax and talk about what happened. Jeff turned on the radio, trying to break the tension, but all we got was static. He flipped through the stations, but it was the same on every channel. "What the hell?" Jeff muttered, giving the radio a frustrated thump. Then we heard it again. The whispering. It came through the static, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice, the same unintelligible words. I felt a cold chill run down my back. "Turn it off," Julia shouted, and Jeff quickly complied. We drove in silence after that, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, and even then, none of us wanted to talk about what had happened anymore. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed us back. I hear random whispers in the dead of night, see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I've tried to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I feel like it's not over. We disturbed something in Silent Pines, something that doesn't want to be forgotten. And now, it's a part of us, whispering in the dark, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. I don't know what it wants, but I'm afraid we'll find out sooner or later. Until then, I keep the lights on at night and try to ignore the whispers, but they're always there, reminding me of the terror we unleashed on that disastrous road trip. So, I've got to tell you about this one camping trip I went on a few years back. It was me, my buddy Jeff, and his girlfriend, Sarah. We were all pretty tight, having known each other since high school, and we thought it'd be fun to get away from everything for a weekend. Just us, nature, and no cell service. We headed out to the secluded spot in the woods that Jeff had heard about from a coworker. It was supposed to be perfect. No other campers, a nice lake nearby, and miles of forest to explore. We got there on a Thursday afternoon, set up our tents, and started a fire. Everything was great. We had some beers, cooked hamburgers, and just hung out under the stars. It was just one of those nights that felt perfect, you know? The next day, we decided to split up for a bit. Jeff wanted to do some fishing at the lake, and Sarah wanted to take some photos of the wildflowers and stuff. I was just into exploring, so I wandered off on my own. We planned to meet back at the camp around noon for lunch. When I got back to camp, Jeff was already there, but Sarah wasn't. At first, we weren't too worried. She liked to take her time with her photography, but as the hours passed and there was still no sign of her, we started to get anxious. Jeff and I decided to go look for her. We called out her name and searched the area around the camp, but there was no trace of her. It was starting to get dark, and that's when the real panic set in. We grabbed our flashlights and kept looking, but the woods felt different at night, more oppressive, like they were closing in on us. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a scream. It was faint, but unmistakably Sarah's. We ran towards the sound, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bouncing wildly. After what felt like forever, we came across an old, run-down cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but there was a light on inside. We approached cautiously, and when we peeked through the window, we saw Sarah. She was tied to a chair, gagged and crying. My heart was pounding in my chest. We didn't see anyone else, so we decided to go in. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. The place reeked of mold and decay. We rushed to Sarah and started untying her when, suddenly, the door slammed shut. Standing there was this guy, tall, heavy-set, with a deranged look in his eyes. He had a knife, and he looked absolutely unhinged. Jeff and I tried to reason with him, but he just kept muttering to himself. Then, without warning, he lunged at Jeff. They struggled, and Jeff yelled for me to get Sarah out of there. I grabbed her hand, and we bolted for the door. As we ran, I heard Jeff scream. I wanted to go back, but Sarah was pulling me, begging me to keep going. We stumbled through the woods, half blind with fear, until we finally made it back to the camp. We collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I wanted to go back for Jeff, but I knew I couldn't leave Sarah alone. We huddled together until I could find the car keys, every sound in the forest making us jump. Once I was able to locate the car keys in Jeff's backpack, we made our way to the nearest town and called the cops. The cops flooded the area where we were camping, and they found Jeff. He didn't make it. The psycho had killed him. They caught the guy, though. Turned out he was a drifter with a history of mental illness. He'd been living in that cabin completely off the grid. I still can't believe it happened. It feels like a living nightmare I can't wake up from. Jeff was a great guy, a great friend, and he didn't deserve what happened to him. None of us did. Every time I think about that trip, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. We went out there for a good time, and we came back with scars that will never heal. So let me tell you about this freaky thing that happened to me on Instagram. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. So, a few months back, I was just scrolling through my Instagram feed like any other night. You know the drill. Double tapping pics, checking out stories, the usual. I was about to call it a night when I got this follow request from a profile named Silent Watcher 23. The profile pic was just a black circle. No bio, no posts, nothing. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I mean, randoms try to follow you all the time, you know? Anyway, I ignored it and went to bed. The next morning, I had a DM from that same account. It just said, "I see you." I laughed it off, thinking it was some troll or a bot. I didn't even reply, but then throughout the day, I kept getting more messages. Stuff like, "I know where you are," and "Nice shirt." It started getting real creepy when I got a message describing exactly what I was wearing that day. Like, what the hell? I looked around, but I didn't see anyone who seemed out of place. I started to feel paranoid, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just some prankster trying to mess with me. That night, I got home, locked all my doors, and tried to relax. But then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a picture. My heart almost stopped. It was a photo of my house, taken from the street. It was dark outside, but the photo showed the light in my living room, where I was sitting. I freaked out, shut off the lights, and peered through the curtains. Nothing. No one was there. I blocked the account and thought that would be the end of it. But the next day, a new account followed me. Silent Watcher 24. Same black profile pic, same creepy messages. I blocked that one too, but the accounts kept coming. Silent Watcher 25, 26, 27. I couldn't escape it. I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do. The accounts were all anonymous and there was no way to trace them. I started to lose sleep, constantly looking over my shoulder. The messages got more personal, more detailed. They knew things about me that no one should know. They sent pictures of me at work, at the gym, even in my apartment. I couldn't figure out how they were getting these photos. One night, I was home alone, trying to calm my nerves with some Netflix. Then my phone buzzed. It was another picture. This time, it was taken from inside my apartment. It showed the back of my head, right there on the couch where I was sitting. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed, but nothing. It didn't make sense. I decided to stay with a friend for a while. I deleted my Instagram account, hoping that would end it. For a few days, it seemed like it worked. No more creepy messages, no more pictures. I started to feel safe again. But then my friend got a follow request. Silent Watcher 28. The messages started again, but now they were about both of us. We tried everything, changing numbers, moving to different places, but it was like this thing, whatever it was, kept finding us. My friend started to see shadows moving in the corners of her apartment, things disappearing and reappearing in weird places. We were both on edge, barely sleeping, jumping at every noise. Then, one night, we were sitting in her living room, trying to come up with a plan, when her phone buzzed. It was a live video request from Silent Watcher 29. My friend, being braver than me, accepted it. The screen was dark at first, but then the camera panned up to show a live feed of us, right there in her living room. We both screamed and dropped the phone. We ran out of the apartment and didn't stop until we reached the shopping center down the street. We didn't know what to do. We called the police, but again, they were no help. We felt completely helpless. Eventually, I went back to my place, but I was never the same. I kept my curtains shut, never posted anything online, and avoided social media like the plague. The messages stopped after a while, but that fear never really left me. Even now, as I'm telling you this, I keep checking over my shoulder. I don't know who or what Silent Watcher was, but they knew everything about me. And the worst part? I have a feeling they're still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. So, yeah, be careful who you let into your online life. It could easily turn into your worst nightmare.